Good morning. Jean and I are going to be tag teaming a little bit this morning, but I'm going to start out, and actually, we're going to start out with something to say just to single people that are here today, because we know a lot of you personally, and we know enough to know that a Sunday morning service about marriage may not be your favorite thing, and it could be anywhere from boring to slightly uncomfortable or even painful for some of you. But honestly, we're really glad that you're here because we know you and think that you are probably people of influence in your own circles of life. And we're really hopeful that there will be something here in this message that God can use in your life. After all, a lot of the principles and things that we're going to talk about really will apply to both marriage and not being married. So, okay, today we're going to be focusing mostly on those last 3 verses of Ephesians 5. So if you could either get those back in front of you in your Bible or on your devices or whatever you might have in front of you. I'm going to read them again, and sometimes it's just helpful to be looking at them while you do that. So I'll wait just a sec. It's Ephesians 5, and then the very last verses of that chapter. So starting at verse 31, it's Ephesians 5:31 till the end of the chapter. It just says this. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. I'm going to read that last verse again. Yes, it's really there. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So, we're a bunch of people in the 21st century, kind of middle class-ish Americans reading this today. And it's really important, I think, that we understand the original people that Paul was writing this to at the time. So here's the most super condensed version of this. So this church in Ephesus was a good-sized church and very culturally diverse. It was a big, important city at the time. Its big tourist attraction was this huge temple to a fertility goddess. And actually, it used to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's kind of a big deal, and it was kind of a big deal city. So there were 3 main groups of people in the church at the time. There was a Jewish group of people, there was a predominantly Greek group, and then a Roman group. All kind of brought their own cultures to church with them. So I want to kind of tell you what marriage looked like at that time. So if you were Jewish, for instance, your marriage had probably been prearranged when you were young. And girls were engaged between the ages of 12 to 15, usually married by 15 or 16, and the men by maybe 19 or 20. The men were able to divorce their wives for a variety of reasons, and the women were, of course, largely child bearers and keepers of the home. But if you were Greek, marriage was really the backbone of your society, but the wife's job was pretty much just to bear the legitimate children, because even after marriage, the husbands continue to use prostitutes and have concubines on a regular basis. And in that culture, the husbands and the fathers did have absolute authority and owned all of the property. If you were a Roman, culturally, a man would get married and divorced as many times as he wished. For women, this amounted to basically a form of legal prostitution until they basically were getting really sick and tired of that. And they didn't want to keep having babies because they felt like it was ruining their bodies. And so they were starting to come up with their own brand of feminism. And they started doing things that were typically male activities like sword fighting and wrestling and things like that. And were seeking to find ways to exert their power over the men. So this is what was going on in the culture when Paul wrote this teaching to the church there. So he's basically saying, hey, men, you need to love your wives, even sacrificially. And hey, women, you should respect your husbands. I'm sure they were thinking, what in the world are you even talking about? This is crazy. We've never heard of such a thing. This was so new and countercultural. It was like wild thinking. So Paul is definitely telling them about a mystery here, and one that they'd never really heard before. So Jean is going to tell us about that.
Thank you, Lisa. Just to be clear, this first part of my remarks is meant for both husbands and wives. I'll get to the specifics for husbands in a few minutes, and Lisa will speak again, particularly to the wives. You probably know by this time that a biblical mystery is something that was not clear or was even unknown previously, but now made known to us. That's what's going on here. Paul is revealing and explaining a mystery to us. And it's important that we understand what he's saying particularly in verse 32, where he says, I am talking about Christ and the church. Of course, Paul is speaking to husbands and wives, but as a picture of Christ and the church. Paul is telling us that marriage is given by God as the most powerful illustration of Christ's love for his bride, the church. In other words, married Christians are ambassadors to the world to show Christ's love and mercy and forgiveness, self-sacrifice and grace, and on to those who see our marriages. People should be able to see Jesus in our marriages. How do you like that assignment? If we understand that, it's obvious that marriage is far more important than we might have thought. Even if we love Christ deeply and respect marriage to the utmost, we tend to think in terms of how satisfying it is for us. Are we fulfilling obligations and so forth? And those are legitimate concerns. They really are. But Paul is saying, you will never really get what marriage means unless you understand this. What I'm really talking about is the relationship between Christ and his church. Then, as kind of an aside, he says, what I said about marriage still goes for husbands and wives. Okay. But what I'm really talking about is Christ and the church. That's the mystery that Paul is explaining to us. God began speaking about marriage in Genesis, but he had determined that he was going to use marriage as a living example of the relationship between Christ and his bride, the church, before time even began. God never needs a plan B. Okay? So the church was not an afterthought. It was designed to be the bride of Christ before history even began. And Christian marriages are designed to reflect it to the world. So in a very real sense, our marriages are not about us. They're about us showing Christ to the world. If we read Genesis, we know that the world and everything in it began to fall apart, began to deteriorate after the sin in the Garden of Eden. For women, childbirth became painful. For men, the ground was cursed, and it was hard to grow food. I assume that some animals began to be dangerous to men after that. And of course, death entered the world. Apparently, also, over time, marriage also deteriorated. Deteriorated to the point where we see some of the ugly distortions of marriage in our own day. I think that one of the most important things the church, which means you and I, one of the most important things we could do is to try to redeem or restore marriage, at least our own marriages. Maybe a better way to say that is that we should try to live out the mystery which Paul is describing to us. How do we do that? What if we don't do that? And what if we don't teach our children how to do that? I think the answer is obvious, that Christian marriage will continue deteriorating. You already know the statistics for Christian marriages, and that they look very much like the statistics for non-Christian marriages. Wouldn't it be great if that began to change? But it won't change if we don't understand how to have what I'm going to be calling a mystery marriage. Leaving divorce aside, there's a thing that I call a so-so marriage. That's not a technical term. But these are not bad marriages. The husband and wife like each other, at least tolerate one another, and they do that well enough and will probably never even think about divorce. And like most of us, they're busy trying to get the kids off to a life of their own, saving for retirement, etc., etc. We would probably say that's a fine marriage. But is it a mystery marriage? Lisa and I have been watching the basketball playoffs. We have, I think, not missed one game. And that brings some thoughts to my mind. Consider some of the very best college players, for instance. Their talents are incredible. They are literally in the top 1% in terms of athletic ability, and yet only a few of them will ever get to the NBA. Those few might be called mystery basketball players, okay, because of their devotion to developing their talents, and they will not settle for anything less. Husbands and wives who strive for a mystery marriage won't settle for less either. As married Christians, we need to go all the way to the marriage pros, I guess I would call it. We could probably take a long time trying to list all of the individual characteristics of a mystery marriage. But I would like to focus on two general characteristics: intimacy and passion. I know what you guys are thinking when I say intimacy and passion, but that's only a part of it. Okay. Jesus said to us in Luke 12 and in Matthew 10, he said, "Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered." That's intimacy. Intimacy is knowing the details. Knowing and caring about your spouse in terms of hopes, desires, worries, and so forth. And then there's one of my favorite stories, the story of Jacob and Rachel. I wish we could go into that. But in Genesis 29, we find this verse. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Wow. 7 years? That's passion, okay? Nothing at all so-so about Jacob's feelings for Rachel, okay? And there should be nothing so-so about your marriage as we try to live the mystery. I know some of you are thinking, hey, look, I live in the real world, and you're talking about fantasy. And I just want to say, no, I'm not. Is it reasonable to think that God can call the world into existence by a word, just a word, but cannot bring about a marriage which reflects the relationship between Christ and the church? For you and me, a mystery marriage ultimately depends on a change of heart. And that is just the kind of thing Jesus likes to do. Just ask him. And so we want to avoid giving distorted images of God and of Christ and his church to the world. Ideally, The world should look at our marriages and say, wow, if that's how loving and self-sacrificing and merciful and forgiving and gracious God is, then sign me up. Okay, let's speak specifically to husbands. Years ago, I preached a sermon here which I called Marriage, Misery, or Ministry. Okay. The idea was that if we don't see our marriages as a ministry, which is basically something we do for God, then we're likely to experience some misery. So take your choice, misery or ministry. So husbands, how do we minister to our wives? You know where we're going, I'm sure. Ephesians 5 again, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. How does Christ love the church? Okay. The husband who loves his wife as Christ loved the church will give up everything, including his life, if necessary. You know, that's pretty easy to say, but it's much more difficult when you have to make a smaller but real actual sacrifice for her. Honey, I'd die for you. Yeah, but I don't want to take out the garbage now. Okay? Also, Jesus puts his bride first. If a husband is making plans, he should first be thinking about what his wife wants, what she needs, and if at all possible, he should try to provide those things for her. Also, as we're talking about, Jesus is intimately connected to his bride, the church. And as we said, intimacy means knowing the details. I've been told that most wives are willing to tell their husbands the details if they would just ask and listen. He also provides for his bride. He serves his bride not as a boss, but as a servant. He loves the church with an unbreakable love. Your union with your wife, guys, is permanent. I know we know that. Your wife, though, should never have the thought or fear in her mind that you would ever leave her, except in the most extreme circumstances. And so, okay, men, our marriages are relationships for which we are responsible to God. And I'm pretty sure that God holds husbands more accountable for marriages than he does the wives. When we get to heaven, we may report that we worked hard and provided for our families. We saved for retirement. We took our kids to church, sent them to good schools, and so forth. But I wonder if Jesus might not ask us, yeah, but how about that wife? You know, did you love her like I loved the church? I am willing to bet that our marriages are more concerned to God than most of the other spiritual, religious, church things that we do. Our marriages and home lives are almost certainly the primary place in which we will live out our Christian lives. The primary place in which we will honor or dishonor God. The primary place in which our witness, our Christian influence, will count the most. The primary place in which we will be or not be disciples of Christ. I want to tell you that right now you are in the easiest place of all to be a Christian, in church. Yeah. The easiest place of all to be a good Christian is a church. It gets more difficult at work, but the hardest place to be a good Christian is at home. Okay? The way we treat our wives and children at home when no one else is around is a far better test of our relationship with Christ than our behavior at work or at church. When I first began to work in a small church in Southern California, I went to a pastor's conference in Pasadena. That was about 40 years ago, and it made such an impact on me that I still remember it very well right now today. We broke up into small groups, and the leader of our group was a very experienced pastor who told us this story. He had been the pastor of a thriving church for many years. He had devoted himself to his duties, sometimes 7 days a week, with many late nights and so forth. After all, it was God's work. By this time, his kids were off to college and life had settled down a bit, and he and his wife met for lunch, something which had not happened very often previously. As they were waiting for the food, the pastor thought he and his wife were not talking that much. There was no trouble, but we're just not talking that much. All I can tell you is what he told us. He said that it struck him like a thunderbolt, that he didn't really know what was going on in his wife's life beyond the surface stuff. Okay? But he did not know, he said, what she was worried about, what she hoped for in the future. He felt very convicted and determined to change things. He went to his elders and told them he would not be spending as much time at the church. And to which they replied, that should have happened a long time ago. I've been doing counseling for more than 35 years now, and I am still waiting for the very first time that a wife comes in and says this: "Can you help me? My husband pays too much attention to me. He wants to know too much about what I think and what's most important to me, how my spiritual walk is going, what he can do to help me. He just wants to spend too much time with me. Can you help?" Okay. I've not had that yet. Okay. The pastor that I was speaking about said that in his love and zeal for what he pointed himself out when he said this, because he was doing God's work, that he had misarranged his priorities, even his biblical priorities. Husbands, should you make your marriage a higher priority in your life? Whatever else might be God's work, I'm here to tell you that marriage is God's work. The pastor said he had come to see that God did not tell even pastors to love the church as Christ loved the church, but that even pastors were to love their wives as Christ loved the church. So, husbands, remember what we said about the mystery of marriage. Our marriages are a reflection of the relationship between Christ and his bride, the church. How are you doing with that? So now Lisa is going to come and say something regarding wives and the mystery of marriage.
Well, I'm pretty sure that there are women here today from all kinds of different marriages. They could be anything from boring or healthy, or between a believer and an unbeliever, or old or new, or you get the idea. So actually my prayer is that the comments that I give right now will be both general and specific enough to maybe just creak the door open a little bit for what the Holy Spirit might have for you in your own life situation. So in this text, Paul tells the wives in Ephesus to respect their husbands. And given the aforementioned history of what the husbands were like in Ephesus at the time, I'm kind of thinking, oh, what in the world did that look like in that culture and now? So yikes, I'm just guessing that the husbands at that time were not exactly professionals at loving their wives as Christ loved the church. That would have been very, very hard work for them to wrap their heads around that, and very countercultural for them, and very new. So just imagine what that would have been like, coming from the backgrounds that they were bringing to it, to be told, husbands, love your wives. Women, respect these guys. So I do think it seems kind of like a divine addition for Paul to have included there that wives respect their husbands, because it would have been a way of encouraging these husbands to lovingly care for their wives as they learn the ropes. So the more affirming that she was in his efforts, maybe the more love he actually developed for her and the family, and vice versa. As he would have been more loving towards her, she probably appreciated and respected him more. So by doing all of this, Christian marriages would have stood out in the culture as examples of Christ's love for the church. So, respecting means to honor someone by exhibiting care, concern, or consideration of their needs or feelings. The church honors Christ by being concerned about what concerns him and caring deeply about the things that are important to him. So, for those of you who might like simplicity or for a format to use, I'm just going to go through a quick list of ways that wives can show respect to their husbands. You don't have to worry about writing this down because actually I think it's in your bulletin, and you don't have to dig that out now. I'm just going to go through this, think about it. It's something that you could, it's just food for thought, okay? So things to do, women, things to do. Say nice things to your husband in front of others. Thank him for his efforts in taking care of you and your family. Listen carefully when he expresses any vulnerability or need. Participate with him in the activities of his choosing once in a while. Be quick to forgive because, and this is important, we are not perfect either. So, things to not do. Don't assume that his perspective is the wrong one. It may be really different than yours, but don't just dismiss it. Don't talk to him like you're his mother. Don't be so critical. And don't make it your goal to change him, because this is really true. You really have no control over that. You have control over you and your behaviors. So this is a great short list of things to do to show respect for your husbands, but actually, I'm sure if we even did half of these things, half of the time our husbands would notice and be thrilled. But I kind of want to talk for a few minutes about who we are as Christian women and why we would even do these things. And we do them because respecting our husband really means caring about him and honoring what's important to him, and even understanding any wounds that he may have in his heart. It's being able to give to a place in him where he may feel frustrated or dejected. It's a way, actually, of thinking about your husband, and maybe a different way. But it kind of boils down to just plain old empathy. The ability to feel with someone else as you step outside of yourself. This can kind of be a tough one because our culture continually teaches us that it's all about me and how I feel, as though that's a virtue. Sometimes think about the situation as your husband experiences it. You don't have to feel the same way he feels, but you consider his opinion and value it. When you're able to see things from his perspective, it honors and affirms him, and it opens the door for closeness. This concept might be a little hard at first, but it really is just a general life skill, even outside of marriage. And as Christian women, what we're doing here is giving a gift to our husbands. And it's a gift because we give it as unto the Lord. It is really not meant to get anything in return. I want to tell you a true story about that actually illustrates some of these things I'm talking about. I have a friend who's a psychologist, and one of her specialties is working with missionary families when they are on home assignment. So the mother of this family had expressed some just sort of common concerns about how the father was interacting with the children in this family, among some other things. And as my friend, the psychologist, got to know this family a little bit, she started to notice that this wife seemed to have many strong opinions about things, and that she seemed to think she was pretty much right about all of them. So eventually my friend gave her some homework. It was to do this. Each week, she was to think of one positive thing about her husband or what he had done. But part of the assignment was to tell him about it in a way that didn't make it seem like she was evaluating him. You know, that sort of compliment that goes, "Thank you so much for helping me, the kids, with the homework tonight, because I'm really not used to that." Well, the wife practiced this for a while. And kind of weirdly, my friend said that the husband began to be nicer to the wife and the children. And when I asked my friend why this would have been the result, she said, "I really don't know. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but studies do show that receiving a compliment releases dopamine in a person's brain. So maybe that dad was just feeling happier." By the way, that's true. So wow, sometimes there may even be rewards for following the biblical teaching of wives respecting their husbands. Being caring and practicing empathy with our spouses does take a certain level of maturity, both personal and spiritual. Sometimes it can seem kind of weird and scary to try or change our behavior. But 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and discipline." So as we know him, as we Christian women know him and walk with him, he's the one that gives us the power and the love and the discipline to grow and do things that might seem hard. So I'm just going to turn it back over to Jean for a closing comment.
In all of our planning, this was one of the things I forgot, which is that Lisa was going to be closing and I wasn't, and so I did not invite the worship team back up yet, but I'm doing that right now. We're going to listen to a couple of more songs, and then we'll have a closing prayer. And thank you for coming, and thank you for listening.
Why don't we stand together?